Hello, my friends. This is Ivy, or otherwise known as Lady Foxglove, and welcome to a new longer form series of content that I've been wanting to start for a long time, where we really take a deeper dive into topics of mental health and how they exist in this space of Magic the Gathering. You know, Magic the Gathering has a rich and super complex and varied history. And I know when I first started playing, I didn't realize that. I thought it was cards with pretty pictures and there was some flavor text, but otherwise it was pretty open-ended. And so it's only recently that I have really started to appreciate the character depth and the growth and the stories and everything that this game has to offer if you're willing to dig a little deeper and look into it. And so we're going to be doing these. I don't have a schedule, just as topics come up, as people express an interest, things along those lines, on different mental health topics and how they intertwine with this game space. And so for those of you who don't know, I have a doctor of psychology. This isn't a scripted show. This is something that I have a rough outline of, but this will just be something that serves as a more conversational starting point. So yeah, I have a doctorate of psychology and I specialize in all of the hard topics, right? Death, grief, sexual abuse, trauma, disordered eating, sex, all of those things that no one really likes to talk about. And so with that being said, I always like to start our shows with a trigger warning. This show will contain some pretty rough topics, and I just encourage you to take care of yourselves however you need to. Everyone has different stories that they bring with them at all times, and it's important that you do what you need to take care of yourself and make sure that you're staying safe. I, of course, love it whenever somebody listens, but if you're not in a headspace to listen, or if this just isn't a good time or you're not feeling it, that's okay. Roll with that, take that. Go do something that feels better. But today, we're talking about grief and how grief exists, how grief is portrayed in Magic the Gathering. And I want to start by just chatting a little bit about grief. We're going to be looking at the kind of powerful driving factor that grief can be in this space, in this magic universe, how it can drive forward character growth, how it can drive stories forward, all of these, narratives that it kind of gets rolling with. And we'll also take some time to look at, what it does right, what it does wrong, how it coincides with the research, things like that. But I wanted to first define grief. Grief is a small word that holds a lot of meaning. And for me, what I think of when I hear grief, and what I always carried with me in my work, was I thought of grief as all of the thoughts, feelings, and body reactions we have after a loss, after experiencing a loss. Now, traditionally, I have focused on grief from the standpoint of a death loss, specifically of a death loss of a significant person in your life or in someone's life, a parent, a grandparent, a sibling, a child, key personnel in a person's life. But that's not the only kind of grief there is. There is grief of losing a home. There is grief of losing a friendship, maybe not to death, but maybe just from a falling out. There is grief from a pet death. There is grief from a divorce. There is grief from being fired from your job. All of these things can constitute grief. But for this episode, we're really going to be looking at grief mostly from the lens of a death loss and some of the rippling effects that can have. Sound good? I think it sounds good. I'm so excited to be doing this. This is such a big passion of mine, is talking about grief and death and dying because it's a hard topic for folks to talk about. You know, some things that I always like to warn folks with. One, I say the words death and dead and died a lot because I don't think they are bad words, right? I think that especially in the United States, especially in North America, there's this taboo around talking about death. But it's okay to talk about death. Death is one of the few, sometimes I would argue only, commonalities that all people experience, and that every person experiences death, and just about every person experiences grief. Most people will experience a death loss of someone in their lives before they themselves die. And so it's this really common experience, and I think we as a human populace do ourselves a disservice by not being willing to talk about it. Because also what we know, and what we'll get into with some of the characters we're going to talk about in here, is, oh my gosh, grief can feel so isolating, right? Grief can make you feel like you're going crazy. Grief makes you feel like you're losing your mind. And the biggest way that we can feel connected in our grief, the biggest way that we can feel like maybe we're not so alone, is through talking with other people. But we're told that that's not okay. We're told that we're supposed to move through our grief, right? Get over it. Time heals all wounds. Go through your stages. But that's not how grief works, and we do ourselves a disservice by continuing to act like grief is this easy thing to navigate, that you can work yourself through these stages and come out on the other side and you're good. And that you don't need to talk about it, and that we should avoid saying words like dead and that someone died because they're bad words and we shouldn't talk about that. No, we should talk about it. People die. And when we start saying words like someone died instead of, oh, they passed on, or, you know, we lost someone. No, we didn't lose them. We know where they are, in a sense. We know that they died. It's funny, I used to do a lot of work. I would do play therapy with little itty bitty kiddos, 3 and 4 year olds. And we would do grief therapy, grief and trauma intervention. But we would do it from the lens of play, because play is how young children can most easily express their lived experiences. And so many times, a 3 or 4 year old, if you say, oh baby, we lost your daddy, the answer or response we get is, where did daddy go? When's grandma coming back? When can we go see my uncle? And anything we can do to get rid of that ambiguity and to take some of the taboo out, I think, is a good thing. So that's a little bit about what we're going to be talking about today, really focusing on, how magic shows grief as not just a personal experience, though, but also as something that can really impact a person, impact their development as a character, and how they use that, sometimes effectively, sometimes not so effectively. But looking at some character examples, I think the first and probably biggest, most well-known example would be Liliana Vess. She's up there with my favorite Planeswalkers. I don't know if she's my absolute favorite anymore, but that's a story for another day. But a very, very quick, brief rundown for those of you who don't know. Liliana experiences the death of her brother, and the heartbreak and shock of that death is what drives her to, really start to crave power. What really cultivates her association with necromancy, because she wants her brother back. And even that, I think, is such a poignant metaphor for what so many people in our worlds experience. We call it magical thinking. It's this thought of, oh my gosh, if there's something I could do to bring them back. And in the back of your head, a lot of times that things aren't going to bring someone back, but God, you wish that they would. And so you start doing things. You start, maybe you get really religious. So you start to pray, or, oh my God, you wish you could switch places with this person. Anything to make them alive again. Liliana lives in the world of magic, where things like necromancy and stuff exist, to the point where she actually did bring her brother back. And what we saw was that it was not a good experience. It was not a successful endeavor for her, to the point where she eventually had to kill her brother again because of what he came back as. And I think that's really, something that Wizards hit on the head with Liliana's character development, in that it shows grief isn't something that we get to shortcut, right? It's not something we get to circumvent. The longer we wait to experience the feelings that come with our death loss, the harder it's going to be. In Liliana's case, it's a very literal case, right? She could not face the reality that her brother was dead. And so she quite literally prolonged her grieving reaction, her grieving experience. And, I think that if Liliana hadn't done that, right, if Liliana had let herself grieve, let herself experience the death of her brother and grieve and do what she needed to do, she could have saved herself a lot of heartache and a lot of difficulty. But instead, she did what so many of us do. She pushed it down. She tried to find a way to get around it. For some of us, that's pushing our feelings down. For some of us, that's getting really distracted in our work, or we start using drugs and alcohol to suppress our feelings. We start engaging in risky behaviors. Anything that distracts us from this wound that we have. But while we're ignoring this wound on our hearts, it festers and it grows and it makes us sick. And in Liliana's case, she had to go through it anyways. And it was worse, because by the time she had to kill her brother that she brought back from the dead, talk about an extra layer of trauma, talk about an extra layer of healing and work that she would now have to go through. And we find it the same with us. The longer you let that wound that is grief fester, the sicker it makes you and the harder it is to clean it out. And that's not to say it's easy to clean it out, because God, it hurts. It hurts so bad to do the work that comes with healing your grieving heart. It's not an easy journey. It's a really hard journey to take. But just like when we get any other wound, we have to clean it. And if we don't clean that cut on our leg, even though it stings, if we don't clean it, it can get infected. And it makes us feel worse. Grief is that wound on our heart that does the same thing. But for Liliana, grief was also a motivating force for her. It drove her in a direction that really influenced her entire character, right? She viewed her inability to escape this grief, her inability to prevent her brother's death. she viewed this as a failure for her. And so what did that do? She needed more. She thought she needed more from herself. There was something she was lacking, she thought. And this is where we can look back again into that magical thinking, right? So often when someone dies or when we experience some other kind of loss, oh my God, do we wish that we could find a reason for it or find a source of blame. And so sometimes we engage in magical thinking where we think, well, if only I had done this, they would still be alive. I should have done this. If I was better, this. If I was a better son or daughter, they wouldn't have killed themselves. If I hadn't told my sister that I was smarter than her, she wouldn't have gotten addicted to drugs and died of an overdose. And we tell ourselves those things because we want there to be a reason. Because even if we blame ourselves, a lot of times that self-blame takes away some of the ambiguity, and it's easier to cope with, this is my fault, than the thought that sometimes shitty things happen and there wasn't anything we could have done about it. For Liliana, this looked like forming 4 different demon pacts and selling her soul a few times and, doing all these things that, truthfully, yes, I know this can sound silly, right? I know this can be a weird thing to try and equate a all-powerful necromancer to real-world representations, but it's there, And I made a short-form video once, a TikTok, probably a couple years ago, and it said, Liliana wasn't crazy, and neither are you. But that's what grief does. Grief makes us feel like we're crazy. And grief makes us do things that we wouldn't otherwise have done. Grief makes us change our character. It makes us make some morally questionable decisions that maybe we know is wrong, but when you lose someone to death or, experience another heavy loss like that, there's no guidebook for it. There's no neat and clean line. There are no neat stages that you can go through one at a time. So I'm going to try and keep these videos around the 20-minute mark. And so with that in mind, we are going to start wrapping up for today. But oh my gosh, I appreciate you all for sitting in this space with me. So today, to recap, we talked about grief and what grief is, and we started to look at our first example of grief, which is one that I feel like a lot of people are most familiar with, right? This example of Liliana Vess and how her experiences of grief really coincide and do a good job of representing this escapism that we can run into with grief and how grief can make us do things that maybe we wouldn't otherwise want to do. And also how she really demonstrates that there is no escaping the grieving process, right? So that's what we've looked at today. Next time, we're going to dive into another character or two. I think next time we're going to look at Nashi as a more recent one, how his loss of his adoptive mother, Tomio, really impacted him and drove him forward, and what that did for him as a character and as a person. But grief is such a powerful theme. It is everywhere in this wonderful game we play, and it's a really hard topic to talk about. And so we're doing this to maybe show that we can talk about grief, we can talk about death and loss and all of these other hard pieces of life that we all have to experience, and that by doing it, it makes us better, it makes us stronger, it makes us more capable. So With that being said, if you or someone you love are going through the process of grief right now, I am so sorry. You are a part of the world's shittiest club that no one ever wanted to be a member of. But you're not alone. There are people who love you and who are willing to walk this really hard journey with you. I'm one of those people. My name is Ivy, or Lady Foxglove. Thank you so very much for joining me today, and I will look forward to chatting with you all again when we come back to talk more about how grief shows itself in our wonderful world of Magic the Gathering. Take care now, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.